Let's see. All right, so what did we say last time? We're learning a mimer here in Shir HaShirim, on Shir HaShirim, in the book Likuti Torah, from the first Rebbe of Chabad. And we started off by a sentence in the Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, a sentence that said, and go out and see Tzana Ura'ena, go out and see Banot Yerushalayim, Banot Zion, the daughters of Zion, and the king Solomon, when he's with the crown that his mother crowned him. So it said, what is it? What in the world is it talking about? So it says it's talking about God, and it's talking about the relation between God and the Jewish people, and that there's this very dynamic, how do you say, very deeply personal and real relationship between God and the Jewish people. Okay, so the Rebbe starts off by saying, you have to realize that what we're talking about here makes absolutely no sense. There is no possible way that we can conceive of what God is. I mean, we can understand things that God does, namely everything that happens, God is doing it. And God is creating us every second brand new. God is giving us life every instant brand new. God is creating all the angels, if you believe there are such a things, and all the spirits and the power. Everything is being created by God. Time is being created by God. Then, but it's the job of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, that's sort of like how do you want to call it, a whole different dimension of things over here. A whole different dimension. It's like putting, real money with Monopoly money. You play the game Monopoly, and all of a sudden, one of the Monopoly bits, it's a real $1 million bill. It's a whole different ball game. It's a whole different thing. The Jews. So the Jews, they're the ones that are supposed to keep the world going. They bring godliness into the world. They bring life into the world. They reveal God in the world. That's why they have the Holy Temple. They reveal there's a creator in the world. They reveal this new dimension. They put the whole Monopoly game on a totally different level of reality. The whole world. So it says, how do we do this? It says the Jews, that's called drawing down from what we call Kodesh without a Vav to Kadosh with a Vav. Holy, a level of holiness of God, which is only relegated to God alone. That's called how God surrounds the worlds, to bring it into this world so we feel godliness. And we talked about this. That's what it means. Lift up your two hands and bless God. There's two aspects of what's called lifting up your hands. One is total surrender to God. Total surrender without any idea, no comprehension, just God, you're the creator, you're creating me, I'm not creating, I don't know anything. Then there's another aspect of God, which is called how God fills the world. That's appreciating God. That's the aspects of God that you sort of can understand a little bit. Like in the Kabbalah books, it talks about these upper levels and spheres of God and aspects of God and different worlds of God and revelations of God. That's called the lower aspect. Okay, generally speaking, we Jewish people, therefore, we cause this whole entire business to be real. The world to be going, God enlivening the world, God to reveal himself in the world, God to reveal different aspects of himself in the world, God to reveal his essence in the world. And it all depends on how we Jewish people serve God. And it says even to the degree that we, so to speak, even control God. That's what King Solomon was referring to. Let's go back here. when it said, go out the daughters of Zion, and the King Solomon, and the crown that gave to him his mother. Who is the mother of King Solomon? In this case, where King Solomon is a metaphor for God. And who puts this crown on his head? His mother. When the day that he got married, and the day he's happy. So who is this mother? So you have to realize this thing of King Solomon. This is an allegory. It's very tremendously accurate. Tremendously accurate. Every example he gives, every parable, every metaphor, every mystery, everything is very, very exact. It's very exact. The problem is we just don't know what exactly he's referring to. But a little bit we can know. And this is what the Rebbe is saying. The Jewish people, when they serve God, because that's the way God set up the world. I mean, it doesn't mean God is not like a being or a person or something. God set up the world. He creates the Jews, and the Jews have this power because they have free will. So they have the power to actually, so to speak, control God. It's not that they really control God, but that's the way God set it up. He set it up in such a way that he said, okay, if you Jews do what I want to, then I'll do what you want to. That's don't ask God, just like he chose the Jewish people. What does it mean he chose the Jewish people? He has this special expectations from the Jews, and correspondingly, the Jews have a special effect on God. He chose us. That's something they did something. Okay, again, I want to reiterate. This makes absolutely no sense. Don't think that in any way we can start to understand what God is now. You can understand aspects of God. You can understand what God does. And it's a commandment to try to understand God. It's a commandment to love God. To love God means you have to appreciate him. To fear God is maybe a little bit easier, even though there's different levels of fear, which the highest level of fearing God is much higher than love. It requires a much greater, surrender. But let's just talk about loving God. So with loving God, you have to, if you want to say fearing God, so okay, I don't want to die. I'm going to die one day. I don't want to die right now. So God has it in his hands. God can turn off the switch in 1 second. Wow, so I'm afraid of God. But what do I have to love God for? What am I loving him for? Well, he's keeping you alive. No, if he didn't keep me alive, so he wouldn't keep me alive. What's the big deal? So it says, okay, you should love God because of how good God is. So that you have to think about. You have to love God because there's details how good he is. He creates the stars, he creates the skies. That's the prayers that we do in the morning. The praises of God, called Likuti, called Pesukei de Zimra. That's what King David did. He praised God. Why did he praise God? So we'll see in a minute that this has an effect on God. God reacts to what we do. This is very, very stressed by the Baal Shem Tov. Very stressed. You should know, we talked about this before, there are religious Jews, serious religious Jews, and they've got the whole thing wrong. Really, definitely religious Jews, God-fearing Jews, wonderful people, honest people, intelligent people, know the whole Torah, and they get this whole thing wrong. And they say that God does not react to what we say, what we do. God's too high. Okay, what the source of their mistake is not now to talk about, but in the Tanya, it does talk about that, especially now what we're learning, Shir v'Emunah. They think that somehow or other God removed himself from the world, and that God is so incredibly unlike the world that there's no way that he can react to what we do. But God does he likes the world, so once in a while he, of his own free will, just shoots a couple blessings down here, and if we make the best, that's what they think. But that's not true. It's simply not true. Simply not true. God does react to what we do. It makes absolutely no sense, but it's the fact. Okay. So we draw godliness down into the world, and that says raising your two hands. Two hands. One is how God fills the world, and we're God to appreciate God, to love God. Okay, but we draw down into the world, right? Hine, behold, we're making God revealed in the world. Now, just so that you don't think this is too, out of reality, science fiction or whatever, religious fiction. So there was such a thing as the Holy Temple, and in this Holy Temple was the same revelation as there was at Mount Sinai. And there was such a thing on Mount Sinai. There was such a thing. God actually revealed himself, gave the Jewish people the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. And eventually, even though Moses broke them, but eventually he gave them the whole entire Torah. So God personally himself did reveal himself, the creator and the creation. This doesn't make any sense. It's not even in the category of sense. It's not even in the category of sense. We talked about this before. It's like bringing a big bag into, university and say the whole day I went around with this university, I didn't catch one idea. That's ridiculous. A bag can't catch ideas. Well, your mind can't catch God. But aspects of God and understanding that we can't understand God's essence, this is also a very important. One second, someone's calling me up over here. Someone is calling me up. Okay, how do we draw down all this godliness in the world? How do we make the world into a holy temple? How can we make the creator revealed in the creation, improve the creation? Like we said before, when God is revealed here, the world becomes healthy. The world becomes real. People are not, one second, am I doing something wrong over here? 1 second. People are not being pushed or pulled or controlled by all sorts of worries and anger and destruction and aggressions and depressions and addictions and things. That the world can get along really well with those things, without those things. But that's what it means when God will be revealed in the world. The most external thing is that it's going to be good physically. The most external thing. It'll be good physically. It'll be a joy just to be alive. But it all depends on the Jewish people. So how do the Jewish people do it? Hamshechazu, but they're a klal in general. It says, these words that I command you. What are these words? The Torah. The words that God commands us, says these words that I command you should be on your heart. This is drawing the Torah. The Torah is a book in the library, just like every other book, so it seems. But don't let it fool you. Just like the Jewish people are a people like every other person, other people, and the Holy Temple is just a building like every other building. But it's not so. The Torah is pure godliness. The Jewish people are the sons of God. The Holy Temple was the house of God. Like I said, this makes no sense whatsoever. It's totally absurd. And the Rebbe is going to say that in a second, but it's true. Because the real fact of the matter is that this world is called the world of lies. The whole world is a big bluff. And when a person dies and he goes to heaven, it's a little bit less of a bluff. Because when a person goes to heaven, so he sees that there's a creator, even though that he can't serve the creator. In this world, you can serve the creator, but the world itself is 100% false. Maybe 99.9. There's one little tiny bit of truth, and that's the Torah and the Jewish people and the Holy Temple and the commandments. And anyone who connects to that is true. So it says that's the whole idea of the Torah. We have the Torah in the world, that the Torah comes from Anochi. It comes from the essence of God. Mitzvot, I command you. This is command. The word commandment in Hebrew also means to connect. Iskashos v'hi amshachas chachmei Eloah This is drawing down from God's upper wisdom. Ki araita b'chachma nafkes, because the Torah comes from God's wisdom. The Ibichin is Yud. This level of God's wisdom, this is the Yud of God's name. God's name has 4 letters. These 4 letters indicate on different aspects of God. The Yud of God's name refers to the highest of the 10 sefirot, which is God's what's called wisdom. That in this level of God's wisdom, this level of Chachma, is enclosed the essence of Ein Sof Baruch Hu Mamash. Corresponding, it says we're made in God's image, so a little bit corresponding to this level of Chachma by God, in us the level of Chachma is faith. And faith becomes a vessel for godliness, right? There's all these people, the leftists, whatever, and the intellectuals and the professors, whatever. There's no such thing as God. Why? Because I don't understand them. So the answer to that is right. That's what God is. That's the reason that there is God, because you don't understand them. It's something above understanding. So how can you know that there's God? You have this thing called Chachma. Chachma is translated loosely as faith. And the intellectuals, the professors, they totally discredit faith. Faith is not, even though it's pretty stupid because they have faith in themselves, they have faith that they're right. They say the people with the most faith are poets. Poets have most faith because they have faith that somebody will read their poems. Faith, they don't have faith. If you don't have faith, you won't even get out of bed in the morning. You have faith that something is going to happen good. You don't know what it is. And these people also have faith. Okay, so here we're talking about utilizing this power of faith. In other words, something that you don't know intellectually, but that you can be sure of. Like it says, you can be half sure and wholehearted. Okay, that's Viktor Frankl's word. Half sure means that intellectually you don't know, but your heart can be told. Derech Prat in general, and this is the kavanot of Kriya Shema. This is what we call the intention. We're learning this in the morning when we're talking about the spinal cord, remember? So that all the commandments are like the bones and the vertebrae, and that the spinal cord, that gives life to all the limbs, moves all the bone. So that's the kavanah, that's the intention. That's like the spinal cord. That's the intellect, which is inside of all these commandments. And when a Jew does the commandments, when he learns Torah, he has to always remember that these are coming from God. And that not only are these coming from God, but they are God, and they bring godliness into the world. Just like a limb brings your will into, manifests your will, right? You want to pick up a pencil, you do it with your hand. Who's picking up the pencil, your hand or you? I said, well, that's ridiculous. I'm picking up the pencil, but I'm doing it through my hand. The same thing with the commandments. The commandments, when you do the commandments, you are uniting. That's mitzvah, means connecting to God. I thought you're just doing a commandment. It's just like when you pick something up with your hand, the you is the main thing that's picking it up. The same, the commandment is the commandment of God. God is the main thing in the commandment. And by means of the letters of Shema Yisrael, there's 248 letters of Shema Yisrael corresponding to the 248 commandments. Mamshichim, you draw into godliness into the 248 limbs of God, which is called the upper man. This is like Isaiah saw the man sitting on the throne, appearance of man sitting on the throne. Also Ezekiel saw. And when we do the commandments, this draws godliness into the world, from the upper man to the lower man. Now, I just want to repeat this again. This does not make any sense, but this is the way that God set the world up. That's one of the conditions that God made the world under. That the whole purpose of this world is that the Jews would be here, the world would try to confuse the Jews and to oppose the Jews and to stop us from doing commandments. And nevertheless, the Jews would overpower this and overpower themselves and overpower their own fears and doubts and etc. And that they would overpower this and they would do the commandments. Why would they do the commandments? Because that's what God wants. How do we know there's such a thing as God? That's what's called chachma, faith. Hagam, even though it's impossible to understand these davar b'pratios, we cannot really explain this in any details. Ke'ein lo demut haguf. God hasn't got a body. What do you mean that from our body we can understand God, from our personality we can understand God? That makes no sense. That doesn't make any sense. How can we understand God? It's like almost like saying by looking at a piano, you can understand what music is. Huh? Looking at a piano. You look at a violin, you can understand Paganini 100%. That's it. You don't even know what they was talking about. What do you mean? And the same thing, looking at a person, you can understand what God is infinitely more ridiculous to say. But the fact is that God made us in his image. Because that's where God speaks. And that's how the Torah says, but there of Mashal Malitza, that God gives all these examples in the Torah. Therefore, we have permission to talk about this, God's wisdom and God's the level and God's brain and God's, because the Torah speaks in this language, so we have permission. Well, I didn't understand. Let's at least understand a little bit about this, what it means that we are in the image of God, that when we have the proper intention in the Torah and the commandments, that draws godliness into the commandments. It's like God's body is the commandments, and our intention arouses God's life force to come in to the body of God, which is the commandments. Says the Rebbe, you can't understand it, well, you can. Let's try. Gam also, Razal say, the rabbis say, Malani aleichem ki lo asuni. The rabbis say that if you do the commandments, I treat it as though you made me. Asitem otam says asitem atem. You, Jewish people, you make God, so to speak, in the world. I mean, can there be anything more ridiculous than that? It's obvious that God makes us, he creates us. We don't create anything. But nevertheless, God says that when you do the commandments, you make me in the world. You create me. That's what we said before, why we're called God's mother. That we, so to speak, tell God what to do. So on the other hand, you can think, what type of a God is this that we tell him what to do? Who wants to worship a God like that? I want a God that's like really, infinite, and he's above everything. And the answer, sure, God certainly is that. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't limit. Don't limit God to being unlimited. God is not limited to. How do we know maybe we can worship trees? Trees are also God. What's wrong with that? Says that's what we have the Torah for, to tell us what is permissible to. First of all, God is the only God you can worship is the one that took the Jews out of Egypt. So a tree did not take the Jews out of Egypt. Only one God took the Jews out of Egypt. So that's a starting point. It is like this. That's for the whole world. That's for the whole world. The whole world must worship only the God that took the Jews out of Egypt. That's the God that's creating us. Inyan is like this. It says Yaakov, Vayikra Shmo Yisrael. That God called Jacob angel, called him Yisrael. This is relevant to this week's the thing we're learning in the morning also, where Bilam makes this blessing, Laura Amul B'Yakov, Kesem Yisrael, or Perush Yisrael. There's two names of the Jewish people. One of them is called Yisrael, and the other one's called Rosh, Yaakov. Yisrael is the letters Li Rosh. This is the letter. God says, to me, they are the head. The Jewish people, they create this level of God, of the head of God, so to speak. What does it mean? They create God's head. Hainu al derech mashal, for instance, sheyesh barosh, a person has a head, right? What's in the head? In your head, you have brains. People have brains in their head. Inside of the brains are a vessel for consciousness, awareness, understanding, reality. Chachma means conception, consciousness. Bina means understanding. Dat means realization. And then there's also, that's the brain. Then there's the skull that covers over the brain. That's Yisrael Li Rosh. The Jewish people, they make God into a head. They create God's head. Kach Yisrael, the Jewish people, they draw down this level of mochin, chachma mocha. This is the level of God's awareness. Iyu machshava milgov. This is drawing the Torah, which is in the physical world. Okay, so let's get this straight. Let's not get carried away over here. God is infinite. God is incomprehensible. But God creates a world and God wants to be revealed here. If God is infinite, then where do you grab onto? You got to grab onto something, right? You take some putty or something and you make it into a human being, right? You have to start off somewhere. You can't take nothing and make it. If God is really infinite, that means he's incomprehensible. How do you make from that God comes into the world? So he says that's the idea of the Torah. The Torah, God gave the Torah. God put his wisdom in the Torah. And when the Jewish people learn the Torah and they do it with the proper attitude, so to speak, they bring God down from his indescribable oneness into the world, into the Torah. And just like a person has his brain and the brain controls the rest of his body, so God starts to be controlling the world. This is drawing down the Torah, which is in the physical world, which the Torah is God's upper wisdom. Like it says, Lo yada enush erko, no human being can possibly grasp the value of what the Torah is. Shalafi pshuta, that the simple, if you look at the Torah in a simple way, and they call them Mikra Tanakh, all of the Torah, the prophets, the writings, it's who Malekimat Bisipuri Maises. The whole thing is just stories. If you look at the Torah, the whole thing is really stories. The whole entire 5 books of Moses is just stories. The beginning is the story of creation with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then after that, the story of Moses. Then after that is the story of what God says to Moses. God spoke to Moses, he told him this. God spoke to Moses, he told him this. It's not just a book that has these laws in it. It's in story form. God spoke to Moses and told him, you should put on tefillin. God spoke to Moses and said, keep Shabbos. God spoke to Moses and gave him the 10 commandments. This is a story. The Gam also Torah Shabbat Peh, and also the Talmud and the explanation, which that does have laws in it. Shorshim, their foundation, the source of them, comes from this upper wisdom of God. Don't think just that the Bible, 5 books of Moses, comes from God, but the words of each one of the rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, Hillel, those are the words of God. She'ein seichel anushi, that no human being can really grasp the reasons of the Torah and the laws. That's why these men that wrote the Talmud were tremendously holy people. Most of them had the power to raise the dead. Even according to Kabbalah, peace over him, even the secrets that we are given, we don't really understand what they are. We understand that they are. Even a little bit that's written by us, even the little bit of Kabbalah that we have, there's no way you can really properly explain it to its true depth and its true reality. How it comes from God's chachma that's put into the physical world. Like Trumos or Maisros, all the stories in the Tanakh, the portions you have to give to the Kohen, all these seemingly very mundane things, they're tremendously deep. Listen, we don't have to go so far. Let's just take a simple. Nowadays, there's this big battle going on in the world. Is life worth anything? Is life worth anything at all? To have children, to give birth to children, is that just a big burden, a ridiculous, how do you say, a curse on mankind? That's life. You have to make as many abortions as possible, and people should use, contraceptives. They shouldn't get, and they're homosexuals is okay. Anything not to have children. No children. which on the face of things, there's big professors, they're very intelligent people, that they push this insanity. In Germany, it was really big. All the big professors before World War II, they were killing anybody who couldn't produce. Old people, mentally ill people, people with any sort of defects a little bit. They couldn't run, they couldn't work. Get rid of them. Right? I mean, it's tremendously sick, but on the other hand, it's superficial, the most superficial way. And it's the same thing over here. People have a tendency to look at things superficially. And that's the way it is with human beings. Right? Just killing people superficially. Right? The Nazis, how many people they killed? Just killing, no problem. Killing, hey, you're not really killing anything. You're just pulling up a little piece of metal, a little trigger, and the guy drops down. That's all. What's the problem? Everybody's going to die anyway. Life is but a dream. Is that really true? It's not true. The same thing with the Torah. You can look at the outside of it and you don't feel the life. You don't feel the preciousness of it. Life is something which is incomprehensible. The life in the Torah comes from the source of the life of this world. If the life of this world is incomprehensible and it's valuable, and it is valuable, infinitely more so is the wisdom in the Torah. But on the other hand, there's the body of the Torah, which just hides over. Or since because it is God's wisdom, the Torah is God's wisdom, and it's understandable as Ella Shehi Hasaga Nifla. It's just tremendously deep, and there's levels and levels and levels of depth to it. She'enu musagas b'seichel, that cannot be understood by human being. Rachoka Yimeodme says that King Solomon, he reached to these levels of understanding. But these levels of understanding come from the essence of God. Shu Ram, and he said that God is tremendously high. Ram Vanisa, La'ain Kates without any end. Taluya bi Yisrael Amata. So therefore, the whole entire business, it depends on the Jewish people. Like we said before, lift up your holy hands, thinking, contemplating what's called the upper unity and the lower unity. That's what we talked about yesterday. You can look and see on YouTube yesterday's class. Last week, 5 days ago. So that's what's called the Torah. But afterwards, these words that I commanded you by means of this, they are drawn down to be revealed. Infinite light, Anochi, comes and is revealed in God's wisdom. So first of all, you revealed, so to speak, the body of God, which is the Torah, and then the intentions, that draws down the life force. That's the brain. Then above that, above the brain, God's brain, we said, we make God a head, right? That's Yisrael Li Rosh. We make God into a head. The head, we said, is we draw down the awareness of God into the world. A head is a skull. The skull covers over the brain. This is what's called God's will, which is above God's wisdom, because will is above understanding. And that the Jewish people draw down by means of they themselves surrendering their will. That each Jew has this, being surrendered to God, even though that there's Jewish people that don't have any understanding. And they don't think about the greatness of God at all. And the Rebbe is almost like knocking out everything that you just finished saying in this whole paragraph here, that you have to think about God, and you have to contemplate God, and there's different levels of contemplation, and you have to try to understand. Now the Rebbe is saying, good, that's as far as God's wisdom goes. But as far as God's will goes, a Jewish person, every Jew, without exception, wants to do and is even willing to give his life to do what God wants. And it is impossible for a Jew to go against God's will. The problem is that the Jewish people have to activate this feeling. They have to activate their identity. Asher lo yuchal laharchiv v'lamich sechlo v'bina. So even though it's a person that's very simple and he cannot open his mind to these ideas. Nevertheless, by means of bittul ratzon, by means of totally surrendering his will without any understanding whatsoever to God, like it says, Yehi ratzon, may it be your will, God, as we do the will of God, and God reacts by drawing down what's called how God, he fills the worlds and surround the world. And even more, and we're going to stop in another 2 minutes. God's right arm, the Jewish people draw down by giving charity and kindness that they do in the physical world. And also the left arm of God, by a person strengthening himself and holding himself back from doing what God wants, holding himself from transgressing what God doesn't want, right? By holding ourselves back, no matter how much you want to eat that, cheeseburger or whatever it is, you stop yourself. No matter how much you'd like to say a nice something against your neighbor, a little, I say, lashon hora, they call it slander. It's just so juicy. So, everybody's going to really enjoy it. You hold yourself back from saying it. Is by means of this, you're going against your nature, that this draws down God's left arm. And there's also tiferet. You draw down God's beauty and God's mercy to us by means of us having mercy on others. And that's where we're going to stop over here, God's mercy. So what are we talking about here? What are we talking about? We Jewish people, we act, God reacts. The Jewish people learn the Torah in this world, God reacts, brings his wisdom into the world. The Jewish people, they surrender their will to God, God brings his skull into the world. The Jewish people give charity and kindness, that's God's right arm. The Jewish people strengthen themselves to hold themselves back from forbidden things, that's God's left arm. And next time we'll talk about Rahmanis. But what we want to say here is that God reacts to everything that we do. And to that degree, so to speak, and not to take this in the wrong way because it can't be understood, we control God. God, so to speak, is forced to react to what we do because that's the way God set it up. It's not because we really have some power and God is separate from us. But now the Rebbe is telling us the mechanics, the dynamics of how exactly it works, and it requires a lot of personal, want to call it sacrifice, devotion, arousal, interest, genuineness on our part to the Creator. As we'll talk about more, God willing, next week. That's what King Solomon wanted from his love song, Shir HaShirim, that we should love God and evoke God's love for us by means of the Torah, commandments, and prayer. We'll talk about it, God willing, next week. Thank you very much. Hope to see you. Shalom uvracha. Shalom.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. See you.